With psychiatrists looking on, the recruits were subjected to a battery of tests designed to measure not only physical fitness and mental acuity, but to separate the leaders from the followers.
I'll give you an example of one. They said, go out behind to the barn. There's a great big barn, and open the door and you'll get instructions. Well, you go out, open the door, it's pitch black. The speaker speaks up and says, close the door. So you close the door, turn left, feel your way along the wall, put your right hand out, come to a ladder. Well, they give you a series of instructions, and pretty soon, there's no question, you're 4 stories up in this black barn. And they said, reach out, there's a bar, pull yourself out, hang down, and then silence.
At that point, a voice commanded the recruit to let go of the bar.
What the hell do you do? You drop 4 stories in the black?
Those recruits who obeyed the command dropped and were surprised to find a platform covered with hay just a few feet below.
Those guys are your troops. They do what they're told, and they take instructions well.
Recruits who thought better of it and climbed back down the ladder had a surprise waiting for them, too.
How absurd to drop 4th. Of course I won't do it. And they climb on back the way they came up, saying, well, I guess I'm not in OSS. Oh, yes, you are. You have good judgment. You're the staff officers.
Then there were the recruits who looked around for another option.
Actually, if you were hanging there and kick your feet around, there's a ladder about 2 feet behind you. You can climb down the ladder to a floor and say, all right, next instructions. And those are guys who are, potential commanders. They'd look for a third solution, something different, some way out of it.
There were many others, each designed to gauge the candidate's mettle under simulated field conditions. Adding to the stress of it all was the fact that most recruits had no idea why they were being tested. Assessment weeded out 25% of OSS recruits before they reached basic training.
The requirements were high in the sense that the men were being asked to participate in unconventional warfare. They not only would be fighting and exposed to death, but where they would not always have the protection of the uniform, where they would be spies or saboteurs or subversives, and consequently they would be exposed not only to dying in battle, but to mistreatment, torture.
Recruits who did qualify were sent to one of several secret OSS training schools. The first and most famous of these was a British facility in Canada called Camp X.
The British SOE was mindful that if there was an invasion in England, they needed the ability to have a fallback position or a school for training agents that was not in England. Camp X was such a secret that originally it was concealed from even the Canadian War Cabinet. They did not know of its existence. But it became somewhat legendary in its successes.
Agents from SOE, the OSS, and even the FBI trained at Camp X. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the OSS established its own camps in the Maryland mountains, on Catalina Island off the California coast, and at Congressional Country Club in Maryland. In a grueling 3 weeks of 18-hour days, OSS agents learned to send Morse code, repair radio transmitters, how to operate in a hostile environment, and to develop and maintain a cover. OSS candidates learned how to recruit agents and follow people without being seen, how to forge documents, sabotage utilities, and, if necessary, to kill, silently with the knife, garrote, or with their bare hands. By the time an agent completed OSS training, he or she was qualified in an array of subversive, criminal, or deadly practices. Everything from lock-picking to throat-cutting. But the enemy too had been trained, and after 2 years of war, he was experienced, ready, and waiting.
Sworn to secrecy will return to the OSS.
America was not ready for war. The preemptive Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 had further impaired the United States' ability to respond to Axis aggression. Time was needed. It would be long months before American industry could turn out the weapons and materiel necessary for an effective counterattack. In the meantime, the OSS prepared to fight what, for America, would be a new kind of war. Donovan's OSS was divided into 7 separate branches, each with a specific purpose and mission. The RNA, or Research and Analysis branch, pieced together what Donovan called the raw material of strategy. It was staffed, for the most part, with the formidable group of scholars Donovan had appropriated from America's universities. RNA was headquartered in Washington. From here, they were able to actually create intelligence by analyzing thousands of seemingly unconnected bits of information.
Uncle Sam is interested in any snapshots or photos you may have made on your travels abroad, showing cities, docks, railroads, airports, or any other places of strategic importance. Headed by Colonel William J. Donovan, an Office of Strategic Services has been set up with a pictorial records branch to collect and sort such material.
R&A scholars scanned newspaper obituary columns to count the number of German officers killed in action. From these figures, they were able to provide the Allied leadership with a remarkably accurate count of German troop strength throughout the war.
You don't have to have spies for everything. Spies are only used for a very small percentage of the total take of intelligence, even to this day, even more so to this day.
The Research and Development branch was comprised of scientists, inventors, and even boasted a few crackpots. Their assignment was to develop unorthodox weapons, schemes, and plots. The sort of dirty tricks and booby traps, according to Donovan, that no enemy would suspect the straightforward, fair-playing Americans to be capable of. R&D was as proficient in counterfeiting foreign currency as they were in developing a silent, flashless submachine gun. But for every idea that paid off, there were many others that didn't. Stanley Lovell, head of R&D, devised a plot to inject Hitler's vegetables with female hormones in hope that Hitler's already emotional temperament would be driven over the edge. The plan foundered when the OSS couldn't insert a gardener into Berchtesgaden. The MO, or Morale Operations branch of the OSS, was made up of journalists, Madison Avenue copywriters, playwrights, and Hollywood screenwriters. These men and women of letters spent their days and nights churning out propaganda. Changing the enemy's mind required more ingenuity than shooting at him, but it often proved to be a more effective way of defeating him. Also in the MO payroll were expert forgers who fabricated false orders to German troops in the field. In Italy in 1943, certain units of Field Marshal Kesselring's command received orders to retreat.
And it was so authentic that over the airwaves, Kesselring had to dement it, that he never issued such an order. Because units receiving these forged papers started retreating.
Black propaganda worked equally well on the other side of the world. Forging the documents was often the easiest part of a black propaganda operation. Trickier still were the other parts of the scheme, obtaining the right raw materials for the documents and then disseminating them to the enemy so as not to arouse suspicion. In 1945, Betty McIntosh was an OSS agent working in morale operations in India. Here, the MO's primary mission was to help convince the Japanese army in Burma that they were losing the war and should surrender.
I drew up what was an order from the high command in Burma, saying that in case we're surrounded, if we're wounded, we are out of ammunition, out of food, and the situation is hopeless, then you may surrender and you will be forgiven by the emperor.
The order was written on rice paper and with ink the British had captured from the Japanese. The finished product was then planted on the body of a dead Japanese courier. The increase in subsequent surrenders by Japanese troops in Burma was attributed to this and other morale operations missions. Donovan encouraged his agents in R&D and MO to go to any length to undermine the enemy. His critics within the military high command decried the OSS's dirty tricks as waging below-the-belt warfare, but Donovan ignored them as he pressed his no-rules war. The MO spread rumors throughout the Reich. The Allies supposedly had developed a new bomb that sucked the oxygen out of the air, causing death by suffocation. The Allied rockets carrying bubonic plague were supposed to be landing in German towns. Heinrich Himmler had ordered German housewives to baby breeding farms. These rumors and dozens more were carefully calculated to chip away at the enemy's psyche and spirit. There's no way to measure the effectiveness of the black operations run by the choir boys of the Morale Operations branch of OSS. But it's been estimated that as many as 10,000 German troops deserted as a result of OSS propaganda. And while this war of rumor and disinformation was being fought, the cowboys of OSS were fighting an even riskier, unorthodox war of subversion, sabotage, and intelligence gathering deep behind enemy lines.
Sworn to secrecy will return in a moment.
The secret intelligence and special operations branches were the cowboys of Bill Donovan's OSS. They operated behind enemy lines, either on their own or in concert with members of the resistance. Their mission was to identify, recruit, train, and supply resistance groups in Axis-occupied countries. Meanwhile, sending back information regarding enemy defenses, supplies, railroad schedules, and troop movements, anything that could help Allied military planners.
It was important to know who in France, who in Yugoslavia, who in Italy would work with the invading troops. It would be important to know what individuals were leaders, what resources they had, what capabilities they had to carry out specific tasks such as blowing up bridges, demolishing railroad tracks, carrying on any kind of activity that would impede the movement of the Germans on the one hand, or that would facilitate the movements of the British and the Americans on the other.
For his field agents, Donovan chose young people who were more likely to be fearless and daring.
I think the age usually was between, say, 19 and 25. We were awfully young.
The Special Operations or Operations Group branches of OSS engaged the enemy in a less clandestine, more proactive way than the Secret Intelligence branch. SO, besides subverting and sabotaging through any means at hand, engaged enemy troops in paramilitary operations together with the resistance and as independent units. Operations Group, or OG units, wore uniforms in the hope that if captured they would be considered regular troops protected by the rules of the Geneva Convention. American military strategists had selected North Africa as the ideal launching area for an invasion of Axis-held Europe. But first, the Army would have to successfully land on and take control of the African coast. The area was controlled by the French Vichy government under the watchful eye of German intelligence. The Americans needed to determine what kind of resistance such a landing would encounter. The U.S. State Department had a trade agreement to sell food to the Vichy government, which included a provision for 12 American food control officers to supervise distribution. The 12 officers sent to North Africa were actually spies, codenamed the 12 Disciples. Later, when America entered the war, the Disciples were assigned to the OSS. They set up clandestine radio stations throughout North Africa to supply vital information to the planners of the 1942 invasion, which would be known as Operation Torch.
The American landings in North Africa depended primarily upon surprise and deception. There is no question but what Donovan's organization did a job in gathering basic and current intelligence on landing points in North Africa, not only about facilities, weather, terrain, but people. At one point, they even spirited out the harbor master to help guide troops on the landing.
The OSS had dramatically proven the value of intelligence gathering during Operation Torch. But now, Donovan's cowboys faced an even bigger challenge as the Allies prepared to strike into Axis territory. SI teams were sent into Italy preceding troop invasions to gather intelligence and make contact with the Italian underground. In France, SI agents were dropped by parachute or put ashore by PT boat or submarine. The vast coastline was difficult to patrol effectively, and when the moon was down, it was nearly impossible to spot a landing party. Many agents preferred these coastline drops to the even more dangerous night drops from an airplane.
That in itself was a major clandestine operation. Setting up a landing zone, setting up signals to make certain that they were dropped at the right time in the right location and the right people were there to meet them.
Landing zones were prearranged with the resistance and marked with bonfires or crossed car headlights. Dropping down through the night sky, each agent hoped that his contacts below hadn't been compromised and replaced by a Gestapo welcoming committee. Since a suitcase would be a dead giveaway on the ground, an agent had to wear everything he brought with him. It was imperative that an agent's cover be perfect. The Gestapo was everywhere, and any slip, however small, could have dire consequences. Many of the most effective SI operatives were women.
As a courier, for instance, especially if a girl was pretty, she had an enormous advantage. A girl could always smile and sort of flirt a bit with the German soldiers. And whereas, of course, a man couldn't do that.
German intelligence operated vans with radio direction finders to track OSS transmissions. The trick to transmitting intelligence from hostile territory was to keep moving.
In working any kind of radio, you've got to be very careful in terms of being spotted by the enemy, and they can find you. There's no question about that. It isn't as easy as Hollywood shows it, where they can get you in whatever hotel room you're in. It doesn't work that way. It never has.
It was more secure to be in the city than in the country, because the idea would be an apartment building where if you were on the air for too long, you could be spotted to the building, but not necessarily to the apartment. So if you had somebody watching, it was easier to run away.
In rural France, SO units collaborated with the Maquis, resistance members who took their name from the spindly, aromatic evergreen bush that grows wild in the French countryside, dense enough to conceal bandits. Working together, the OSS teams and Maquis units terrorized the occupying Germans to the point where they were afraid to move off the main roads at less than convoy strength. The resistance disrupted supply lines so completely that some German troops were forced to live off the land, nearly starving in the process. The resistance had no love for the German invaders. Their operations were swift and brutal. They took no prisoners. In the winter and spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared to invade Western Europe, there were more than 500 OSS-controlled agents operating in France. There would soon be more. The OSS and SOE devised a plan to parachute 50 three-man teams into France to coordinate resistance activity for the Normandy invasion. These teams, consisting of an OSS or SOE officer, a French-speaking officer, and an enlisted radio operator, were codenamed Jedburghs, after a town in Scotland. Not only were the Jedburghs charged with preparing the resistance for D-Day, but an equal part of their job lay in keeping the lid on, scaling back underground operations so as not to attract German attention to the area. The resistance was not given the actual date of the landings, but told to commence operations when they heard the BBC broadcast the second verse of a poem by the French poet Verlaine. The lengthening shadows, the sad strains of the violins pierce my heart. On that signal, the Maquis swung into action, destroying key bridges and railroads, blocking German supply lines and hampering their retreat. The liberation of Europe was underway. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the OSS was fighting another guerrilla action, far behind enemy lines.
Sworn to secrecy will return in a moment. We now return to the OSS.
In March of 1942, the Japanese army occupied Indochina and Thailand and was driving into Burma and Malaya. U.S. Army General Joseph W. Stilwell's 50,000-man army had been forced to retreat 200 miles from Burma into India by a Japanese force of vastly superior strength. Vinegar Joe Stilwell did not believe in paramilitary warfare, but he had run out of options when the OSS presented him with a plan for a guerrilla force to engage the greatly extended Japanese behind their own lines. A group of 21 commandos, codenamed Detachment 101, under the command of Colonel Karl Eifler, was dispatched into the Burmese jungle. Its mission was to harass and sabotage the enemy wherever it found him. All I want to hear, Stilwell told Eifler, is booms from the jungle. In the jungles of northern Burma, Detachment 101 encountered a fierce tribe of natives called Kachin. But luckily, these natives hated the Japanese even more than the Allies did. The Japanese had terrorized the Kachin, burning their villages, and the tribes were more than happy to join with the Americans in a war of retribution.
This group really attacked the Japanese from behind the lines and worked making life totally miserable for the Japanese in Burma. In those days, it was important to keep the Japanese occupied so they wouldn't push into India.
The OSS trained the Kachin until they were expert with explosive handling and Morse code. In return, the Kachin showed their OSS partners how to rig deadly booby traps with a crossbow and tripwire, or how to hide bamboo spears on either side of a trail, so that an ambushed Japanese patrol would be impaled while diving for cover. Within a year, Detachment 101 had 29 field stations in Burma and India, and was staging almost daily forays against the Japanese. General Donovan arrived unannounced in December 1943 to see for himself what was shaping up to be an OSS success story. Eifler flew Donovan 150 miles behind enemy lines to visit a guerrilla base, a somewhat reckless excursion considering what a prize a captured American intelligence commander would make for the Japanese.
And they took off over Japanese lines, and they had something that they used to call an L pill that the important people would have, and this would be a pill, if you took it you would be dead in an instant. And the general supposedly always carried one around. At this point, I was told by Colonel Eifler himself, Eifler asked Donovan if he had his L pill along, and Donovan said, "Oh, I forgot it." And I have the feeling that Donovan never carried an L pill, being a good Catholic.
Detachment 101, growing eventually to a force of 10,000 Kachin, fighting alongside 500 Americans, stopped the Japanese advance cold. By the end of the war, they were responsible for 5,447 Japanese dead, and another 10,000 missing and wounded. During the same time, only 184 Kachin and 18 American officers were lost in those actions. 10th Air Force, based in Assam, India, reported in 1944 that the Kachin operating with the OSS accounted for 85% of its intelligence on likely targets. That same year, OSS agents made another journey, this time to North Vietnam, where they hoped to enlist the aid of Viet Minh leaders against Japanese troops in Indochina.
One of the things the team found was all of the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese leaders were all sick. And Paul Hoagland, the paramedic that was with the team, happened to have some sulfur powder, and he saved the lives of all these top leaders.
The Viet Minh were grateful and more than willing to provide intelligence and assistance in fighting the Japanese. But there was a catch.
They also had in the back of their minds that they wanted help with the United States government to get rid of the French colonial power. And that's the one thing that the U.S. government did not want to do. And so there was a falling out after the war. But basically, if you want to say that OSS saved Ho Chi Minh so he could be a trouble to us later on, that's true. We did save his life.
When the end came, the OSS was in the midst of gathering intelligence for the invasion of Japan. The cost in lives the RNA people had determined would be enormous. Projected estimates of Allied casualties numbered as high as 1 million. The atomic bomb and the subsequent Japanese surrender brought a sigh of relief to the entire world. Little more than a month afterward, the OSS, America's first clandestine military organization, by now numbering nearly 13,000 operatives, many of whom had risked their lives behind enemy lines, was officially disbanded by President Harry Truman. The new president had decided that an intelligence agency was not needed in peacetime. Moreover, Truman, a Democrat, did not number among Donovan's fans. He considered the intelligence chief a dangerous Republican and a potential foe who harbored plans to run for president himself. The contributions of the Office of Strategic Services to winning the war were definite and plentiful. The OSS's role in organizing the resistance in Italy and France alone justified their existence as a credible, often indispensable weapon in the hands of the Allies. Add to that the countless incidents of subversion and sabotage behind enemy lines in Africa, Europe, and across Asia. The life-saving information provided by the Research and Analysis section. The propaganda conceived and disseminated by the Morale Operations branch. All of these efforts and actions, taken one by one, were like bee stings, each causing but a moment's pain, yet their cumulative effect slowly and surely helped bring the Axis giant to its knees.
The significant accomplishment of OSS is that it was the vehicle by which modern American intelligence was created. Before the war, there was no Central Intelligence Organization, no wish for one, no desire for one. It was a military and naval activity. What Donovan and OSS did was to project intelligence as not a narrow Army or Navy function, but as essentially a civilian function, which required the professionalism not of soldiers and sailors only, but of historians, geographers, psychologists, anthropologists, engineers, newsmen, broadcasters, and so on and so forth.
In July of 1947, as Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union increased, President Truman signed into law the National Security Act, establishing the Central Intelligence Agency as the United States' first national civilian peacetime intelligence gathering organization. It was staffed for the most part by veterans of the OSS. General William J. Donovan was not offered a post in the new agency.
August is hot. Really hot. 600 miles an hour hot. 200,000 horsepower hot. 1 million tons hot. From monster trucks to superjets, massive subs and turbo tanks. It's a month of heavy-duty metal that's too hot to handle. Heavy Metal Month on Modern Marvels. All this month at 10 on the History Channel.
The History Channel is proud to